We are ready for lesson number 4, Ezra chapter 5. At least that's what I think. Matthew got up yesterday morning and had no voice, and I think now that has turned into a stomach issue as well. So that's where he is at this morning, not wanting to share all of that love with us and give us some sort of a virus or whatever it is that is bothering him. He told me that he got into a little bit to chapter 5, but that's basically where he was at. Does that sound correct to you?
Yes.
Okay. I think we're about a lesson behind, and I was a little bit confused, even though I was here and studied that lesson. I wasn't exactly sure I was where I needed to be. I know Matthew mentioned to read the book of Haggai, and then a little bit of Zechariah. It gives you a background of this particular time in history, and because Haggai is one of the ones that did the preaching to these people, when you look particularly at Haggai chapter 1, he really gives some background to what Ezra is all about, particularly here in chapter 5. And one of the things that caught my attention, and looking back there at that, is that's where in Haggai chapter 1 and verse 5, and also in verse 7, he tells the people, consider your ways. Consider your ways. And of course, we know that the Apostle Paul, 2 Corinthians 13, verse 5, examine yourselves to see whether or not you are in the faith. It got me to thinking along that line that, that's one of the reasons we're here this morning, is to open our Bibles and to remind ourselves. I think that many times our problem is not so much ignorance, but we get too busy. We maybe hear these things and we know they're important, and yet we still don't do them. And I think that this is something that that helps us. That's why assembling together is so vitally important. And as Tommy mentioned in his prayer there a moment ago, the Lord's Supper each Sunday. Some folks say, well, it becomes old hat. Well, if it does, then we really got a problem. But the Lord saw fit to give us something that would help us every Sunday, every first day of the week, to think back to the cross, think back to the blood that was shed, think back to the sacrifice that was made for each of us. And what you see here in the prophets is that they just let slide things they knew they should be doing. And they were neglecting many truths. But because they had been, some 70 years, with that particular captivity, there were probably a lot of the younger folks that maybe had not had the teaching and the preaching that the older folks had had. Anybody with a thought, idea there?
A passage I use a lot, and one of my favorites is Ephesians, chapter 5, verse 4. Paul is telling them how to conduct in just their everyday conversation about cursing and profanity, divorce, joking. It goes on down from there. What led me into this is Saturday, I had to call a guy down at the barber shop the other day for cussing. Right out in the open. Now, it's hard to do. And he didn't much like it. He was 80 years old. And I reminded him of that. I said, Jesus is not going to welcome you into heaven. You sitting there cussing like that. And when I got home, I looked that up, and sure enough, it's there about even our everyday conversation that we have and how we're supposed to conduct it. Because it goes on down there and say it and gives a list of things with that will bless in the kingdom of God.
I think, and we can't get into bad habits such as what you're talking about there. But what's also interesting to me along that line is that it's obvious that we can control it, because I've seen many situations where people, their language was just terrible. But then you put them in a position, many times around me, if they knew I was a preacher, they would tone that down. But I've also noticed too that as they get accustomed to the preacher being there, kind of go right back to that. So, regardless of what my problem is or your problem, whether, it's a problem with their temper, it's a problem with their language, whatever it may be, we need to continually be reminded of the seriousness of those types of things. And one of the things that Haggai does there in chapter 1, after telling them to consider their ways, he talks about the fact that they were living. Now, I guess I should back up. They started, rebuilding the temple, the walls, those kinds of things. And then it did come to a stop with some of the persecution that came. So Haggai reminds them that they were living in paneled houses, and yet the Lord's house remained in ruins. I looked up, what the word paneled means, and there are different ideas. I think the main idea behind it is that they had constructed their houses first. Whether that just meant that they were pretty fancy with paneling of some sort, maybe not. But the real point was you put all your time and your effort, your money into your own houses, and you're living pretty good. You've been back here, some 16 plus years, I think, at this time. And the house of the Lord still had not been built. Now, in defense of them, the persecution had arose in reference to the people of the area, some of the Samaritans and some of the Jews, that had married with the people that had been brought in, so you had a mixed race there. And they wanted to help, and they were told they could not help. We talked about that already. And so they were not happy with the situation, and they began to try to do things that would slow it down or keep it, from happening. So that's the background. Anybody else with a thought there before we sort of dig in? We're on page 43 with the questions. In fact, I still have some books up here, and Matthew's pretty much going verse by verse, which in a way that's what the lesson's all about too. But I found that if I study my lesson, answer my questions, then I pretty much studied whatever Matthew's dealing with. And I think if you're not already doing that, you'll find that to be true. Awesome. Now, anything else? Okay. What two prophets encouraged the Jews to resume work on the temple? Haggai and Zechariah. Yeah, okay. And isn't it interesting that these two individuals are also writers? They're listed as we would call the minor prophets. And one of the things that, again, is kind of intriguing to me is that lots of times you can read somewhere else people that prophesied during those same periods of time, and they were dealing with the same people, maybe making the same arguments that would be made somewhere else. So that's one of the things about the Old Testament. The Old Testament gives you much background to the New Testament, and it would be hard to understand, some of the things of the New Testament. Answering Charlie's question there, maybe think about the Lord's Supper each week. Well, a lot of that goes back to the Passover. And you remember the lamb that was killed and the blood was put on the doorpost as the people were preparing to leave Egypt. Well, there was the shedding of blood. And so we begin to get a picture of the sacrifice that was made and the importance of blood in order for us to be safe, in order for us to be forgiven and redeemed. As we mentioned, the building under Zerubbabel, this went all the way back for about 16 years. And that God started and they had stopped. So both of these prophets were preaching and teaching and encouraging the people to take up the work. And it's interesting that the phraseology talks about Haggai and Zechariah standing with them. It's a little bit unclear, I think, as to whether or not they actually worked with them or whether or not they were standing by to encourage them. But it made me think about the fact that, even today, sadly, I've known of preachers that were considered to be lazy or whatever. They could preach, but would come get their hands dirty. They didn't do that very much. I've always been in a position where I'd rather done that as done the preaching. Hands-on, doing the work. But my point is this: Haggai and Zechariah were not just, saying, here's what you ought to do, and not applying it to themselves. So whether they actually helped hands-on with the construction, or whether or not they were in the encouraging area of encouraging the work, telling the people what they needed to do, reminding them of what had been done, what God was doing. But I think it's a good lesson for us in reference to actually participating. Sometimes, we talk about inviting people to church. Let's use that as an example. But how many of us really do that on a regular basis? We know it's important. We know that, we can't preach to people that are not here unless we get out and go into their homes. And that's important too, that we, talk to people about their soul, that we sit down and open our Bibles. Well, we know that, but do we actually do it? And I think that these two individuals give us a good example to live by, applying their preaching first to themselves and then to the audience as well. And preachers today, I think, would do well for us to understand that principle and to understand that it's important for us to be involved and provide what leadership can be provided. And thankfully, this is something I was taught, very early in the process in reference to preaching or being a minister, that it is vital that you not only be heard, but you also be seen by involving yourself and participating. Anybody with a thought there?
A lot of it comes down to our desire. What do we want and desire to do as far as evangelism goes? If we don't have the desire, we'll sit on the low like it not and not do anything.
Yeah, I think so. It comes back to our attitude, and then maybe over time in the church, maybe we've convinced ourselves that it is the preacher's job, or it is the elder's job, it is the deacon's job, it's the Sunday school teacher's job. Well, that's true, but not just to them only. You remember when Jesus gave the Great Commission in Matthew 28 and Mark 16, he was talking particularly to the apostles as a group, telling them to go into all the world, preach the gospel. But as we continue to read, and as we look particularly at the book of Acts, where these apostles that have been given a commission start applying that, it's very quickly noted that all of the disciples, in fact, with the persecution that came, you get over to Acts chapter 8, it says that the folks were scattered forth from Jerusalem, and they went everywhere preaching the word. Well, who are they? Well, you continue to read there, it tells you that the apostles didn't go. They stayed in Jerusalem. And evidently there was a need for them to remain there, at least at that time, to continue to solidify the foundation, to be visible, maybe, before those that were opposed to the church. So you start reading then of Philip, and then you start reading of Stephen, but those that have been baptized, went everywhere encouraging and teaching and preaching. So it was not just to the leadership, but in fact the great growth came not because of what the apostles per se did, but what the apostles, along with that 3,000 in Acts chapter 2. And if I remember correctly, it's thought that by the time you get to Acts chapter 8, the church was probably about 20,000 strong. So you have that 3,000, they continued to preach and teach, and the church was multiplied. The church really began to grow. And the growth was attributed to the fact that each Christian felt a duty, had the proper attitude, felt the responsibility of telling people about Jesus. How much did they know? Well, probably not a whole lot. How many sermons had they heard? Well, maybe only one or two. And we do know that apostles could lay hands on people, which allowed them to have the gift of knowledge. So they had that advantage. But they did not lay hands on everybody. They went forward preaching and teaching the things that they knew. Anybody else there?
Is this different than if the apostles stayed in Jerusalem there and the group went out? Is this a different story from the ones? You remember when they came back and they reported in?
Oh, the 70 that were sent out by Jesus? Matthew 10, maybe? Yeah.
It's a different story than it's got to be.
Yeah, they were sent out 2 by 2
Yeah.
in that particular time. So this was earlier. And now you're getting into, not that the apostles were not a part of that group, but that kind of set the stage of Jesus authorizing people to go forth with the teaching. And we definitely see that with the apostles. And then when you continue on in the book of Acts, and you find that Peter was kind of the leader there. And we find him later, where was it? Was it Caesarea? The Joppa. And then you get over to Paul, and Paul's doing all this traveling. We know that Peter and John, they heard about the teaching that Philip was doing in Samaria, and they went down there. So it wasn't that they just stayed, but evidently God had a purpose for them remaining in Jerusalem for a time. But then they also dispersed as well.
When he was in Joppa, was that when the centurion sent?
Yeah, Acts chapter 10, yeah. And so, he wasn't in Jerusalem any longer. And then in Acts 15, at Jerusalem conference, a lot of them gathered together. And at that point, James, the Lord's brother, was now one of the leaders or one of the elders in the church there. So, by that time, Paul and Barnabas, they were all the way up in Antioch, and they were going about their preaching and the teaching. Okay, who led the Jews in the rebuilding project? Ezra 5:2. Zerubbabel. And I think that's interesting because, you have all of these different individuals, and maybe the line of thinking that we're getting to, which I hadn't thought about, is the fact that there were a lot of folks that had the ability to lead, had the ability to do what God wanted done. But you do have to have leaders. And Zerubbabel, stepped forward, and, there was an action that needed to take place. They needed not only to begin the work, but they needed to finish the work. And if you think about that in reference to our lives, all of us know of individuals that have been baptized in Christ. and over a period of time fell away. And maybe some of us, maybe that's happened to you. Where we let the world get in the way, we let the business get in the way. So it is important to start. It is important to initially repent and be baptized. But it's just as vital for us to continue in our faithfulness. So some of the work that was done to begin with, when that first group came from Babylon, was wonderful. But they allowed the threats, sort of the bullying, I guess we might say, caused them to fall short. And, James tells us faith without works is dead. These folks knew the importance of that temple. They knew the importance of the rebuilding of the city and the city walls. And yet, they ended up working on their own houses and allowing themselves to be discouraged. What question did the Persian officials ask the Jews in verse 3?
What authority do they have to do this?
Yeah, what authority? Who commanded you? And, it's the same argument they used before. If you go back and find, they started building, they got discouraged, and again, that was the very same question, basically, that they were asked, who gave you permission to do what you were doing? Well, the first time, with those threats, they stopped working. The second time that we're dealing with here, they listened to it. They were respectful to those that and agreed. Sure, write you a letter, send it to the king, but they did not quit working. And I think that's maybe one of the more important lessons here in this particular chapter is the fact that discouragement will come, opposition will come, but we've got to make sure that we don't stop working. And so while they're waiting on this letter, of course, got to go a long ways and come all the way back to the king. They were respectful in those who opposed them, but they were persistent. They kept doing the work. And I think you and I, regardless of what's going on with us, we need to find a way to continue to work, continue to participate. Anybody with a thought there?
You just know, I think you just see this Zerubbabel guy, he had to know the people that were coming in. Somebody had to do the layout. And then some people said, well, you work on the rocks here, you do the timbers over here. And then, this guy must have really been into the Zerubbabel guy.
Yeah, I think he goes back. You may remember that with Moses and the tabernacle, and then the initial temple that Solomon built. And he brought workers from a distance. And he mentioned some that they were good at metal work. There were some that were good at rock work. There were some that were good in construction of wood. And Solomon brought in the best, and he financed that. Well, when you get to talking about Cyrus and then Darius, and Artaxerxes is the Persian king at this particular time. But go back to initially to Cyrus, he helped finance it. And he helped put money into it so that they could get the people that they needed. And it's still true today. You have people with different abilities and different talents. And that's one of the things that makes the church such a wonderful body to get the work done. Some of us have one ability, some of us have another. If I had to leave singing every Sunday, y'all might decide we're going to quit singing. It'd be that bad. But there's things we can do. There's things that God has blessed us with. Now notice question 4. Why were the Jews able to continue their efforts despite the opposition? It says that the eye of God was upon them. So God was with them. God was blessing them. And because of His blessings, now, Was the eye of God on them to start with? I think it's a good question. And I think we can answer in the affirmative. God was with them when they came back, initially. And he was blessing them. But then, maybe a little bit like Peter walking on the water. As long as he kept his eye on Jesus, he could walk. When he took his eye off Jesus, he started sinking. I suspect that when that initial group came back, started building, their focus pretty quick turned to the Samaritans and others that were discouraging them. And so rather than looking to God for his encouragement and blessings, they started looking at all the problems. And, of course, eventually stopped building altogether. Anybody with a thought there? In number 5, to which Persian king was the inquiry made? And this was Darius, D-A-R, if I'm saying it correctly. This was Darius, and initially it had been Cyrus, and then Darius, and then Artaxerxes. And what do we know about him? Go back to the book of Esther. So this was the king that got Esther as a wife. So you can look at that time frame also and see how all this stuff kind of ties together. And so they were doing what they'd been given command or permission to do. But one of the problems that arose is that it had been so long that that person's gone. If they had continued and had worked this out to start with, then they could have dealt with Cyrus, who was desirous of being involved. And rather than have to go now through another king that might have not been all that way, favorable, in other words, to them. They also point out that they were not a threat. That was something that was said in the letter that was sent, suggesting that they were a threat. And they said, well, we're just redoing what had already been done. The temple was here. We're simply putting back what was done. And that argument seemed to work pretty good. They were not a threat to the Persian Empire. Why was the original temple destroyed? Verse 12. Oh, you have the Babylonians, you have the Assyrians, then you have the Romans. And so, depending on what time of frame you're talking about here. But verse 12 says, the fathers provoked the God of heaven to wrath. Israel was God's people. But for them to truly be the people that God wanted to bless, they needed to be obedient. And one of the things that likely these folks thought would never happen is that Jerusalem would be destroyed. The temple would be destroyed. But it was. And it was done so because of the people's turning away from God. Spiritual Israel, the church, that's God's people today. And if we want to continue to be God's people, then we have to be obedient. There have always been conditions, going all the way back to Adam and Eve, that there were conditions that were involved in them being in that special relationship with God. But God eventually will say, I've had enough. And that's exactly what happened here. To whom did King Cyrus give the treasures that Nebuchadnezzar took from the former temple? See if you can say that name. Sheshbazzar, I don't know how you say it. But he was one that was earlier involved with the laying of the foundation and that type of thing. And it's interesting that Cyrus did what he did. And I've got a note here. Cyrus was a Persian, and it's interesting that he supported the people going back, and originally he supported the rebuilding. But his name is mentioned in Isaiah 44, and verse 28, and Isaiah 45, and about, verse 1 and following. So Isaiah prophesied that Cyrus would allow the people to go back and to rebuild. And basically, he wrote that 150 years before Cyrus was in this position. Josephus, in talking about this, said that someone took the record of Isaiah and showed it to Cyrus. And when Cyrus saw his name and knew that it had been 150 years ago, that caused him to basically say, if God wanted me to do this, I'm going to do it. And he followed through with letting the people go back and even financing it. And if that happened that way, that must have been a shocking or an eye-opener to see your name actually in God's Word, and to know that this guy been dead and gone all these years, but he mentioned you, particularly in Scripture. And Cyrus, at least, was a good enough person to at least act upon it and make efforts to help. Now, in order for it to be completed, the temple, you had Cyrus, and you had Darius, and then you have Artaxerxes. So it took over that period of time, and all were involved in one way or the other. So the letter that was written to the Persian officials was for them to go back and check the records and see who, if anybody, had ever commanded it. And that's what they did. And they found out that, yes, Cyrus had commissioned it. And so the people were simply doing what they'd been given permission to do. Anybody have thoughts, comments on any of that? Okay, one final point. It's interesting that the Israelites, as they were starting to rebuild, had all this opposition. But when it came to having the command, permission to do what they were doing, they were very respectful to the law. And I think that's a great lesson for us today. The laws may not be all that we want them to be, but we need to be respectful of that. Even if the law is wrong, even if there is opposition that comes forward, we still need to be respectful and conduct ourselves like Christians should, so that we can have the law behind us. And many times, if you are respectful, then that's much more likely. Anybody with a final comment about that? Okay, it'll be lesson 5, chapter 6, next Sunday. Short of Matthew will be bouncing around like a bunny rabbit.